Hey, I'm AJ.
And I'm Matt.
And you're here at the Excel Climbing Lab, joining us for a discussion and talk about the seasonal transition from probably some outdoor climbing, either to the gym or to get on some ice this winter. So some of the big goals for the talk and discussion today are to provide some insight on climbing training and injury avoidance, discussing some of the common climbing injuries, what they look like, what they feel like, hopefully give you some insight into what you're feeling. Then also talk a little bit about prehab work, some supplemental work on how you can avoid that or get ready to start rehabbing that or working into that as you're climbing. Also, we're going to discuss some of the differences in rock climbing, ice climbing, and gym climbing, give you some ideas of how those differ, especially because as we're transitioning, we want to make sure we modify our plan and how our approach to all those go. Then we're going to discuss some little specifics, specifically in a transition to ice climbing, gearing up for climbing in the gym. And then also, if things aren't going well, when to seek some professional care. So injuries are common. If you haven't had one already, you're super lucky, but over 90% of them are overuse in nature. Most of them involving the upper extremity with the overuse ones, and the acute or traumatic ones are more common in the lower extremity. With climbing, that usually means that you're falling, hitting your leg, ankle, something along that nature. Some of the big risk factors for injury, though, would be being a male, bouldering, have a high body mass index. But the two key ones to kind of point out here and think about, the ones we're really going to dive into today, are training error being the number one factor, and then having a previous injury being the biggest predictor in either having another injury or kind of the one you're currently dealing with worsening. There's some actual factors that would reduce the injury potential, and that would be being an older climber and also being more experienced. So the little bit older you are and the more experience you have does give you some injury resilience and some help in avoiding these injuries. So how do you best go avoid an injury? Obviously, like I just mentioned, the biggest things would be avoiding acute loads or training error in your training or climbing practices. So that could be either, you're getting really psyched, the ice is getting in and setting in well, or you have all this time now that you aren't outside climbing and the gym's really easy access. So that training area, usually the too much too soon is a huge thing to keep an eye on. And that pretty much just means monitoring our training load. So an acute to relative chronic. So how much are we doing currently relative to what we've been doing? A little bit of that's going to continue to be discussed throughout this topic. And we're going to dive more into that in the upcoming slides. But the big key is to increase gradually and just understand that our tissue's capacity, so it's tolerance for how much we're doing, will ultimately dictate when that breaking point or when we kind of have that active response or that acute symptom. One of the biggest ways to avoid an injury is recover. There's a really good quote here. The only training you're benefiting from is the training you're recovering from. So if we go into the gym every day or out to the crag every day and we're climbing hard and just continually bearing ourselves, it's really hard to recover from that. And it's pretty likely that we're going to induce some type of overuse or traumatic injury because we've exceeded that tissue's capacity with that training load ramping up so fast. So load's the answer. What's the question? As again, we just kind of keep talking about load is usually dictates when those injuries set in, whether it's a really acute traumatic load that has something happen really fast or it's a gradual progressive load. The big key is balancing the load with our tissue capacity. So our loading habits, how much we're climbing, how much we're doing, stress in general life, all those kind of things go in with those loading habits. And as soon as we reach above that capacity is when we start to have those reactive responses. So the ultimate goal is to decrease those loading habits while we're increasing our load capacity. So moderating the load while we're building our body up to tolerate more of that. And if we can find that good balance, we can usually minimize the risk for injury. Now, that doesn't mean if we just train, we're going to have this huge injury resilience. And the more we do, the better. There is a little bit of a sweet spot to be had there. So the injury risk will obviously increase the harder you're training, the more you're training. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go ramping things up. There's going to be a key level and a key balance here that will help us perform at our highest level, stay injury free, but also help us improve that capacity along the way. And that sweet spot is something that we're finding with research and evidence. We can kind of monitor, measure, and try to find that right amount. And what we're going to talk about here more is kind of how to monitor that, how to measure it, and then how to find that sweet spot. So I'm going to hand it off to Matt here, and he's going to start diving into that for you.
All right, I can't jump in here without that first slide making me think about AJ reminding me how old I am. And then I'm always telling AJ that I'm less likely to get injured. And then he's probably telling me I'm not trying hard enough. So anyhow, I'm going to jump in and take over a little bit here. So when we're talking about load, there's been some recent research on the acute to chronic workload ratio. And essentially that's a means to take a look at a snapshot in time, basically how much volume of training you're doing in a specific period of time, and then looking over a longer period of time, like a 28-day period in a month, and trying to average that and taking a ratio. So if you just think about creating an arbitrary unit, so for climbing specifically, we could do the volume of time you're training. It's really hard to pare it down to exact minutes of training, but you can basically think about the amount of problems you're doing in a given period of time over the course of a day, and then sum that up over the course of a week. So if we just look at time, so say we were climbing for an hour and a half and we have a certain intensity, you're going to multiply those. That's going to give you a certain number. You're going to add up a total over the course of a given week. And then you're going to compare that to basically the average week total over a course of a month. And you're looking for a sweet spot. So what the literature is showing is that somewhere between the 0.8 and 1.3 zone is that sweet spot AJ was just speaking of. And it's okay to push those boundaries a little bit, but what we see is that when athletes are doing something where they're way below the training load, so if you're down in the more 0.6, 0.4, you're not actually doing enough to create tissue resilience. And that's going to catch up with you in time with potentially not being ready for a specific load that you have to take on. As well as if we go into the higher numbers. So they saw a key point was 1.5. And if you're in that 1.5 and above range, that's really a range where you're potentially overtraining. And that's a warning sign that you want to dial it back a little bit. You're more at risk for an overuse injury there. So sooner or later, it is bound to happen, as AJ mentioned initially. Our business is built out of working with climbers. So obviously there's something there, but we are all going to deal with some sort of soft tissue injury, if not something more significant. And it's really important to just learn to identify what is a small, localized acute flare-up versus what is something that's becoming more of an issue and is going to create more problems in time. So I'm going to discuss the next several minutes, several different conditions where just kind of a quick snapshot on what each of them potentially presents as initially and where they can go if they get more severe. So for the common shoulder injuries, the catch-all term that we hear a lot is impingement. And it's not a specifically great diagnosis. Subacromial impingement syndrome is what this refers to. And it's basically over the top arch of the shoulder, we have the bones where the clavicle and the scapula come together that create this arch. The space below that, between that and the head of the humerus, is the zone where we're speaking of when we talk about impingement. Typically, there's a painful arc of motion. So usually in the mid-range arc of motion, there's pain that can be exacerbated with any internal rotation, which is going thumbs down with movement, because that closes down that space a little bit just because of the articulation of how the head of the humerus moves in the socket. It's typically going to be worse with extreme end ranges of motion as well, especially with that internal rotation component. With this, rest is typically going to get you out of the woods quickly if you can identify it quickly and just take a few days of rest. The common precipitating factors are going to be lots of things to do with scapular mechanics, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. Next on the list I want to discuss was rotator cuff tendinopathies. So a tendinopathy, excuse me, is essentially a tendon recovery gone wrong. So tendinitises are the acute inflammatory processes that we deal with tissue injury. When those have been chronically overdone over time, we get what is basically a malhealing in the tendon, and specific things need to be done to reverse that process, or it's going to continue to weaken and degenerate over time. And so here it's more of a chronic presentation. People get more of like a constant achiness. This will start to present more at nighttime as well, where you'll get that pain at night, especially positionally. And it really aggravates with heavy loads in a lot of positions, but specifically positions that are out in front of the body where the rotator cuff is under load. A couple other ones here. So biceps tendinopathy, it can be both proximal up by the shoulder or distal down in the elbow area. So specifically to the shoulder, it typically presents as an anterior or very front of the shoulder pain. It's often exacerbated by more underclingy positions, or if you can think of compressive problems where you're doing a lot of compression and load from underneath here, those can really flare that injury. And these can become quite irritable and really easy to reflare. Again, this is one where I think if you identify it early, you take a few rest days, you come back to it slow, and then you just really monitor your volume going forward, as well as identifying any weaknesses and adding in supplemental exercises that can really get you out of the woods. But again, these ones are ones that can become quite chronic over time, and getting ahead of them is important. With a labral tear, so this is typically more of a sudden instance while you're climbing. So oftentimes people will report having the arm way out from their body out here, maybe stemming with your arm out and pressing outward, and or a really heavy hard load into a Gaston position. And for this, people typically get some sort of popping and or tearing sensation as they accept that load. There can be a sense of instability or subluxation, which would probably be consistent with more of a significant tear. With this, there's going to be, as you're recovering and you gain range of motion, there's going to be some positions that oftentimes will catch or lock as you're going to reach through different arcs of motion. And that catching and locking is a key identifier. It's also something that means you should probably get this checked out and get a specific diagnosis. Not necessarily imaging at that point, but at least getting cleared out by a physical therapist or another healthcare practitioner to try to identify what it is. And then with these, oftentimes, really rigorous dynamic training is important. So you really need to be able to improve how fast you recruit muscles to stabilize the shoulder and the joint in order to create enough dynamic control to live and climb with these. And I've seen a bunch of them, AJ has too, and they rehab quite well, especially when you have a real pulse on what's going on with climbing and how to specifically create resilience with that. So for all of these shoulder conditions and even further down the extremity, what we do in the climbing lab and what is really important to address is the shoulder's posture and poise. So when we look at people who are dealing with injuries and or weak in certain areas, it almost always presents in certain ways on the wall with scapular mechanics that are changed. So when we're looking at poise, the common things we're looking at are the scapular position. So the shoulder blade in space, is it upwardly rotated away from the spine? Is it tipping forward in that more hunched forward position there, pushing down on that subacromial space? And in reachy positions, more dead point positions, are people establishing some activation through the parascapular muscles, the muscles that live right around the shoulder blade as they're moving on the wall, on the rock? There's been some studies that have been done. One specifically looked at basically the lower trap, middle trap, and several other muscle groups and their activation in corrected positions where people were cued to get into good shoulder posture and then load the fingers. And then also in their naturally chosen position, which was oftentimes a little bit compensated. And what was found is that lower trap and middle trap activity increased significantly when people get those cues, both in a 90-90 position, so a lock-off position, and then also in more of dead hang positions as they're going to pull through a movement. So what this basically means is that you can, in a sense, you can do a lot more training on the wall and avoid doing a lot of the exercises we'll discuss a little bit later. So ISTs wise, rotator cuff strengthening, all the things that we really need to do to create strength in the shoulder can be done oftentimes on the wall with really good mechanics and focused work. There's a couple of pictures here. We're gonna put out some things where there'll be videos associated with this as well. But we're going across the top. So on the top left here, AJ is basically training himself into more of that lock-off position here with pulling back, going into external rotation. And we've all seen people doing kind of the external rotation at the side or the 90 degrees. So this is a version of that, which can be really beneficial for increasing recruitment of all those scapular muscles as well as the rotator cuff. The second positions here on the middle and the top, AJ is going from a dead hang position, then pulling down into a scapular pull down, which is an exercise I really like to use on the wall for retraining muscle recruitment. You're trying to basically keep relatively straight elbows, only a slight bend as you go into it, keeping the core engaged. You're trying to draw shoulder blades down to really increase that scapular activity and then trying to replicate that on the wall. We're finding that a lot of people do well with a lot of overhead pressing. So creating stability at your end ranges of motion overhead with pressing, working on the antagonist muscles can be really beneficial. And then, like we mentioned a moment ago, the eyes, the T's, and anything you can do on TRX bands and or laying over an exercise ball can be ways to supplementally improve the strength in all those scapular muscles. So we'll touch on a couple more body regions and then I'll pass it back to AJ. So when we're looking at the elbow and the forearm, the most common areas to have pain present is in that medial elbow and lateral elbow. And specifically with climbers, I see a lot more medial epicondylitis than lateral epicondylitis or OSIS. And I think that's just because we spend so much more time loading our flexor muscles. It is our pulling muscle group. So with the medial epicondylitis presentation or epicondylosis, it presents in the medial elbow. The big difference between an itis and an osis or an algia or an opathy, there's all these different terms. And everything that's not basically an itis indicates that it's no longer just specifically a localized inflammatory process. It's actually this malhealing of the tendon that I was speaking of a little while ago. And it occurs a lot in the forearm. And it's because we don't rest enough and because we train too much that we oftentimes see this, or we're not trained up for the activity. So this could be an instance where we're down in that on the acute to chronic workload ratio in that lower zone, and we start doing really high intensities for a period of time where we start to see these presentations. With the medial elbow, I spend a little bit less time doing aggressive eccentrics. A lot of people will see that rotation outward with like a frying pan or a hammer, just because we spend so much time loading that tissue anyway with climbing that oftentimes activity modification and doing a lot of soft tissue work in the forearm, and then really focusing on all the other mechanics we were discussing with shoulder poise is important. With the lateral elbow, oftentimes it is good if it's chronic at all to get in there and start loading it right away with eccentrics, just because it's more of a supplemental muscle group, an antagonist muscle group, and can tolerate a little bit more supplemental training on top of the climbing that we're doing. We just have to be careful not to do too much as we're loading the tissue, because if you're going to continue to climb, you got to calculate that into the whole total for your load and workout. So last thing I'll touch on is finger injuries. So the pulley is the most common one. That's the one we hear the most about. And that's basically a tearing of the connective tissue. Sometimes we see it right here, the A2 pulley, sometimes the A4. The other ones that are right over the joints are a little bit less common, but can occur with more significant sprains of these pulleys. And essentially it's a tearing of the connective tissue that keeps the flexor tendons tied down to the bone. So really severe ones can present with not only pain, but swelling as well as bruising in that area. You may hear an audible pop. There's going to be pain with immediately trying any resistance in that zone. And that's an indication that you're stopping for the day at least, if not taking a more significant period of time off, depending on the severity. You may see a bowstringing with really severe ones. These are pretty gnarly. You actually see the tendon pulling out away from the finger, and you can feel the tendon under load pulling away from the finger. Those are ones that you have to splint right away, and definitely getting checked out by somebody who knows what they're looking at in terms of finger injuries for climbers. They don't always require imaging. If they are significant enough to require imaging, it's typically that multiple pulleys are involved and you have pain up and down the finger, and you really can't load at all without significant pain. Oftentimes surgery is not indicated unless there's multiple pulleys that have been fully ruptured. The most stressful position is a full lock-off crimp with these. So when you're retraining, starting in more open hand positions and then slowly over time progressing into more lock-off positions is the protocol. And then being really careful to be consistent with taping. So they've seen that with stress testing cadavers and looking at what the tissue tolerance is within the connective tissue of the finger, taping around your finger can actually add some support to the pulley. So definitely keep tape for a long period of time. Progressive loading is really important, but having somebody help you with the dose of when and how to do that, if you're not familiar with that, would be an important thing to reach out to someone for. So I'm going to switch back over to AJ. He's going to dive into some other topics and get into a little bit more winter sports.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. So segue there from the injuries into the rock versus the ice versus the gym. So big difference in this is obviously the type of terrain. Ice climbing, usually a little more vertical, a little less steep, although I know some of the mixed climbing things, we're getting to see a lot more of that steep overhanging climbing. Gym, again, you have all varieties of terrain, steep, vertical, even off vertical now, even some more. But again, that along with that transition in the rock, from the rock to the ice in the gym, puts different stress and strains on your body. So understanding how that terrain will implicate changes in dynamic and movement and how you have to adapt to that is a huge factor. Another big consideration too, as you transition from one terrain to the other, is the types of holds. So rock climbing, we're using a huge variety of holds, even from trad climbing to sport climbing to bouldering. You know, we can go all the way from like hand jam to a ring lock to small crimps, pockets, all the way across the spectrum. And that can also be found throughout the gym as well. But again, a little bit of that texture difference, the ability to try a little harder in the gym because, you know, it's a little safer, or we feel more safe. And then even with ice climbing, we're usually using an ice axe. So again, that grip stays relatively more consistent. So we're not loading so much through the tendons and the pulleys in the hand as much as we are through the elbow and bicep. So all those changes and all that variability will amount to different stress and strain on different tissues. So taking into consideration that as we're transitioning and ramping up or training is also a thing to consider. One of the big things we see with the change in the season and more so from rock to gym climbing here in Montana, where we don't get a huge outdoor climbing season, is the ability to climb a lot. Usually when we're going outside, there's a hike involved. You know, it's a little more involved to get things up, get things going. You know, the amount of pitches isn't as easy to obtain, so thus the volume isn't easy. But when we're in the gym and the bouldering wall is right there and there's hundreds of problems available, the auto belays, the top ropes, the lead climbing, it's really easy to get a lot of climbing in really fast. And that amount of volume can stack up really quick. So again, with that acute to chronic workload ratio, monitoring that, just watching that is kind of key with that as well. The rock ice gym, again, as I alluded to earlier, the movement types, the styles are a lot different. You can see in this upper picture here, this is a regular afternoon here at Spire when everybody's cutting feet and jumping at stuff. And I just don't think that's probably what we're seeing up in Highlight on a busy weekend when people are ice climbing. Now, and again, the middle ground for that might be rock, depending upon if we're bouldering or sport climbing or trad climbing. So again, the movement variability is also something to take into consideration. And then again, just equipment styles. So again, we're using ice axes and crampons versus, you know, downturned shoes and you know, just big different hold and styles of movement, and all those things in consideration. We need to think about how that will impact the change and impose differences on our body throughout the season and as we monitor that. So this is a little preview and an intro into what we're going to have come out on our YouTube page and our social media stuff for our prep to pull. So basically a warm-up series, kind of getting everybody ready, discussing different ways to prepare to get out and try hard and work hard out there. So this is the first 1, 2, and 3 here are just talking in a big holistic manner, and then we'll speak a little bit to like a Crag warm-up. But with regards to warming up or preparing to climb, the biggest thing is really we want to increase blood flow. So a 5 to 10 minute general warm up, whether it's the stair climber, whether it's biking, even an easy jog, or just some good big whole body movements for 5 to 10 minutes to increase general blood flow is kind of key. And then from the general, we'll transition more into specifics. So again, that's more like a movement preparation sequence. So we really want to make sure with that we focus on getting some good full shoulder range of motion. So those muscles are warmed up, gone through that range in both the shoulder and the hip, especially if we're going to be trying some unique specific movement patterns on the wall. And then we want to also target some gradually target some loading to specific muscle groups. So big ones, again, that we talked about are usually the ones that are going to get injured. So the scaps, the shoulders, the biceps, and a lot of the finger flexors. So if we can gradually start to ramp up a little working up the intensity of that will prepare those to get on and try hard, usually a little quicker rather than going from 0 to 100. And on the right-hand side here, there's a really good example of a dynamic climbing warm-up. This is from Dr. Jared Vagey. He's also known as the climbing doctor. This form is pretty easy to find on the internet with a quick little dynamic warm-up Google search. This really goes through, again, a lot of the climbing specific movement in both the hips, the shoulders, the arms, and then works into a little bit more of the tendon loading or gliding and prep for that. Not so much the kind of the muscle warm up, but again, that movement sequence is kind of key to prepare for that. And then even a more specific progressive warm up is either just working up in a grade ladder. So starting in on maybe a 5'9", working into a 5'10" or 2, transitioning into 5'11", and then working up into that where we're actually trying hard. So our body is gradually prepared for that. This will be, can be session dependent. So it depends on the intent of that session that are we coming in to get a good workout in, to just get some volume in, get a little bit of a try hard, or also prepare to maybe do a hangboard workout later. Based on what our intent is for that session that day will also kind of help us dictate and structure our warm-up so that we're not burning too many matches before we get there, and then our body can't tolerate that load. So those would be great in general for even if we are going outside, but a more of a Crag specific warm-up is really, again, intent dependent. Are we going out to get a bunch of pitches in? Are we going out to work on endurance training? Or are we going out to work on, some strength and power and projecting? Those will all dictate kind of the severity, or the intensity of our warm-up for that day. So gym season or plastic season. I think one of the biggest things, anybody who spent a good summer outside climbing, getting a lot of volume in on real rock, the best thing to do is to take a good transition, break period, ease into that season. Again, as we talked about earlier, it's easy just to get psyched, get in the gym and get a lot of volume in, try really hard because it feels safe, it's easy, and everybody's in there psyched out of their minds to get going. So the best thing you can do is take a little break, monitor it. How much have you been doing? How can I drop it down a little bit? As I started to talk about on the previous slide, having a plan for the whole off season is pretty key. Why are you going into the gym? What are we doing that day? What's the focus? If we can stay really kind of key and structured on what we're doing, it helps us avoid going in and getting stuck on one problem or climbing hard because our buddies are there climbing and we want to just stay and go. One thing to consider doing in this kind of gym season or plastic season is getting a really solid foundation in. So working global strength, the squats, the deadlifts, the weighted pull-ups, those big body movements to really build that base of foundation so that we can be really specific with our loading and intensity from there. This is a really good time also to give our fingers some more specific, consistent attention. Consistency in training or loading is key to that tissue capacity and resilience. So if we have a good structured tolerance and loading program, we really have a good chance of building up that capacity and resilience. And again, this is also a good time to work more specific things that might be kind of lingering from the season, whether it's a little bit of that elbow pain or that kind of pinch. This is a great time to set aside some specific rehab time for that or get it looked at. It's also really good to just emphasize some weaknesses, focus on some skill development, some of that movement practice. What did I struggle this last season? What can I work on? What skills or what drills can I focus on for 5, 10, 15 minutes each time I'm in the gym to really improve that aspect of our climbing? So big thing here as we transition into ice is this is more of a conditioning dependent, but the thing we want to work on is training maximum strength and then transitioning that into endurance. So maximum strength would just be our body's ability to recruit as much muscle fibers and motor units at one time. So this is going to look like really heavy intensity or high intensity for a few reps and a few sets. A lot of what we're about to talk through is really laid out well on the Uphill Athlete page, as well as the training for the Uphill Athlete book. But again, the big goal here is to lay a really good foundation of really recruitment in our body. We're starting to get it really strong, and then we can take that foundation and build it into more climbing specific endurance. So that whole body aspect, those big movements, then we can transition more into specific maximum strength. So that grip strength, especially with ice climbing, holding onto that ice axe or that handle, doing some weighted tool hangs, again, not for really, really long periods of time, but we really kind of want to work up that intensity. So some weighted reps for about 8 to 10 seconds. And it's not to complete failure. We want to make sure we have a couple seconds left over, performing some reps and sets of that throughout the day and progressing that in the early portion of the training season is really good. With that grip strength, then we can also transition into more of that maximum strength of block off training. So this would be great to start with 2 arms. You can work into 1 arm depending upon your level of the ice climber, and the same kind of thing, 3 to 6 sets, looking for a little bit less intense or less duration of the holds here with this. But again, working up to that high intensity. So either adding some weight or working into that 1 arm walk off would be great. And then as we transition into muscle endurance, that kind of takes this big global aspect of we want to recruit all these muscles. Now let's make them all really efficient and really good at kind of working through a lot of that pump or that burn. And so the goal here with this transition in the endurance training is to improve your climbing fatigability. It's like, let's make sure we can keep climbing, our body's ability to turn over that waist and keep going. And that looks just like any kind of standard arc trainings climbing. So, 3 to 5 bouts, starting at 5 to 10 minutes up, down with about equal rest, and then gradually increasing the length of those bouts as we keep going. And one of the cool things we're starting to see with some of the research is this unique modality called blood flow restriction training, what kind of essentially constricts the blood from those limbs and makes your body work a little bit harder with maybe not as quite as much load. And with that, it gets to be more economical with utilizing that aerobic capacity with those tasks. And what we're seeing is that we can see an increase with less intensity and less amount of time doing that if we try that. So as Matt alluded to earlier, is, you know, we want to make sure we monitor that acute to chronic workload ratio, keep an eye out for all those injuries, transition, plan, keep a good foundation going and building from that. But like we saw right at the beginning, it's almost inevitable that if we're climbing and training and trying hard, we're going to have something come up. So if things aren't going well, we think the key is to get in, be seen, and usually the sooner the better. I think the sooner you're in, the sooner you're out. And usually if some things are just creeping up, you can get ahead of those. We can find and isolate some key things that might be happening up the chain or driving that. And if we can start to focus on those, it might help us avoid and overcome some things that might come down the road. Now, acute or traumatic injuries, again, some of those falls, some of those big pops, pulls, snaps, those things that are really, really bad that you can't do your day-to-day life with. Either getting in to see a skilled medical professional, or here in the state of Montana, we have direct access to PT. So coming in, having us look at it right away, making sure you're appropriate to work into this through exercise, and that you don't need to be seen by somebody else to have another look at that. Now with some of the kind of chronic or overuse stuff, that may require activity modification, but again, the sooner you're in, usually the less activity we're modifying or avoiding, and setting up that structured rehab program. So getting the tissues able to tolerate the capacity we want to, progressing them, and then also working in some of the performance training and programming, looking in the movement stuff either here on the climbing wall or at the gym, focusing on some of that skill development, and then developing a plan to progressively work that. So through each season, we're getting stronger and stronger. So just want to say thank you to Tom Goom, the running physio. He did a couple of the infographics we used at the beginning. Those are always great. The uphill athlete had a lot of great information that we used for some of the transition to ice climbing. And also a big thank you to Uphill Pursuits for structuring and putting together these seasonal transition talks for the community. If you need anything, Matt and I are always here to excel. By all means, look us up on our social media page or at the website. Or if anything comes up, by all means, shoot us an email.
Yeah, thanks for your time today.
Have a great day.